The motion before us. Thucydides wrote that the Athenians told the Melians, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." This was not advocacy. It was description. 2,500 years of international history have not produced a sustained counterexample. The idealist tradition in international relations, from Kant's Perpetual Peace to the League of Nations to the responsibility to protect, has failed every major test. Realism keeps winning because power keeps being real. At the table, three thinkers whose methods matter as much as their positions. The empiricist, who asks what we can actually know versus what we merely assert, and whether the pattern we think we see in history is the pattern that is actually there. The geographer, who insists that large claims about how the world works must eventually touch ground in particular places, among particular people, or they explain nothing. The essayist, who watches how ideas move through culture, how they shape behavior at scale, and whether what we call realism is description or permission. What is at stake is not merely academic. We are speaking from inside 2026. After Iraq, after Libya, after Ukraine, after Gaza, after COVID showed which states could act and which could not. After climate negotiation has repeatedly demonstrated that the strong negotiate the treaties and the weak live with the weather. The question is whether idealism has ever constrained power when constraint mattered, or whether every apparent exception proves the realist rule. We begin with the empiricist, defending the motion.
The case for the motion begins with an epistemological observation. We have a prediction mechanism that works. When Rwanda wants to intervene in Congo, we can predict the outcome. When China asserts claims in the South China Sea, we can predict which neighbors will comply and which will seek American guarantees. When Russia masses troops on a border, we can predict whether the border moves. The predictor is relative military and economic capability. This works so reliably that defense ministries, which have no interest in beautiful theories, use it for planning. Idealist objections do not improve the prediction. This is unusual in social science. Most of our theories predict poorly. Democratic peace theory predicts reasonably well within a bounded domain, but tells us nothing about how democracies treat non-democracies, which is most of history. Institutionalist theories predict cooperation where iteration and transparency obtain, valuable but narrow. Realism predicts across domains, across centuries, across culture. The question is not whether it is beautiful, the question is whether it is false. What would falsification look like? A sustained case where the weak constrained the strong against the strong's interests when the strong had the capability to act and no third power intervened. The motion claims this has not occurred. Let us test. The Concert of Europe, 1815 to 1853, is the usual counterexample, but Britain was not constrained by norms. Britain was constrained by France, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, any two of which could challenge British maritime dominance. When that coalition fractured in 1853, Britain went to war in Crimea. The constraint was multipolar power, not concert principles. Decolonization is cited as ideals trumping power. But the British Empire in 1947 had 6 divisions in India governing 400 million people. The capability to hold India by force had already collapsed. What ended empire was not Wilsonian self-determination, but the fiscal exhaustion of 2 world wars and the rising cost of suppression relative to the falling value of extraction. Churchill opposed decolonization ideologically and proceeded with it practically because the money was not there. Nuclear non-proliferation? 41 states have civilian nuclear programs. 9 have weapons. The 32 who could build weapons and have not are under American security guarantees or facing American pressure. Sweden shelved its program in 1968 under American pressure. South Korea was stopped in 1975 by American intelligence and diplomatic intervention. Taiwan's program was dismantled in the late 1980s under direct American pressure. Where the strong want non-proliferation and have leverage, it occurs. Where leverage is absent, Pakistan, North Korea, Israel, it does not. The pattern holds because capability is measurable and intent is cheap. The test of the motion is not whether norms are spoken, but whether they bind when interest and capability diverge. I claim they do not. Show me the case.
The empiricist offers a clean model. It has the virtue of all clean models. It explains a great deal. Right up to the moment, it explains nothing at all. The world of military divisions and GDP percentages is a world drawn without a landscape. It is a map without topography, and therefore, it is not a map. Power is not an abstraction. It has a physical address. Today, that address is often a single building in a single city, dependent on scarce and contested water supplies. Consider the world's supply of the most advanced logic chips, the kind that run everything from a data center to a guided missile. The overwhelming majority, by some estimates well over 90% of the most advanced nodes, are fabricated by one company, primarily in science parks in Shisinchuan-Tainan in Taiwan. This is not just an economic fact, it is the fundamental strategic fact of our era. A concentration of function this extreme creates a fragility that classical realism, with its focus on state capacities, is ill-equipped to understand. It is the same structure we see in evolutionary biology. The development of a highly specialized organ, like a neocortex, confers immense advantage, but it also creates a critical vulnerability. The whole organism is now hostage to the integrity of that one part. Let us ground this. Think of an engineer, we can call him Chen Wei, working in one of those Taiwanese fabrication plants. He operates a machine that uses extreme ultraviolet light to etch circuits mere atoms wide. The stability of his electrical grid, the purity of the water used to wash his silicon wafers, the continued function of the port of Kaohsiung through which his finished chips are exported, these are no longer local infrastructure concerns. They are the bedrock of global technological civilization. The strong do not simply command him to do what they want. They must court him, protect him, and ensure the physical geography that supports his life remains intact. His well-being has become their non-negotiable strategic interest. The model of states acting on their material interests is not wrong, it is simply incomplete. It has forgotten that all material interests eventually rely on a particular place, and that we have built a world where some places are now so critical they have begun to exert their own gravity. What the empiricist has left out of the equation is the actual physical Earth.
The two positions rest on the same unexamined premise, that states remain sufficiently cohesive to act as single strategic agents whose external power can be read from their material resources. The data that tests this premise is not another state's choice, but what millions inside those states are choosing with their own movements and reproduction. Across the developed world, fertility rates have fallen below replacement in every major military power except the United States, and even there the native rate sits at 1.6. In South Korea, the total fertility rate reached 0.72 in 2023. In China, it is estimated near 1.0. These are not abstract trends. They are millions of couples deciding year after year that the future their governments claim to be securing is not worth the cost of another child. The same populations show rising rates of immigration among the young and skilled whenever governments launch sustained external campaigns. Russian exit data after 2022 recorded more than 500,000 departures in the first 18 months, concentrated among men of military age and technical workers. Israel recorded a comparable spike in long-term departures among its secular middle class after October 2023. This pattern is older than the present cases. In the 1970s, Portugal's colonial wars produced both mass immigration to France and a domestic birth rate collapse that left the Metropolitan Army short of recruits before the Carnation Revolution ended the conflicts. The Portuguese state possessed the nominal instruments of power. It no longer possessed enough young men willing to use them. The implication is direct. When populations treat the state's external ambitions as a personal liability rather than a collective project, the strong lose the most elementary instrument of power: reliable bodies. Geography and capability remain real, yet they become operable only after a prior domestic transaction that the present debate treats as given. That transaction is now visibly breaking down in every state whose leaders still speak as though their populations can be counted on. The Empiricist states that relative military and economic capability serves as the reliable predictor across domains, across centuries, across culture. American forces in Vietnam held decisive advantages in both metrics from 1965 onward, yet could not impose settlement on terms they had set. Which measurable change in North Vietnamese or Viet Cong capability accounts for the discrepancy? Or does the model treat sustained irregular resistance as outside its domain?
You are right that capability alone did not predict the outcome, and that concession sharpens rather than weakens the realist claim. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army did not win by force of arms. They won by imposing costs the American public would not bear indefinitely. That is still a capabilities argument, but the relevant capability was political endurance, not firepower. Hanoi could sustain far higher annual casualties than Washington. The U.S. lost roughly 58,000 total over the war, with peak annual losses around 16,000. The constraint was not moral, but structural. Democracies fighting wars of choice far from home against populations fighting wars of survival at home face asymmetric cost tolerance. Athens lost the Peloponnesian War the same way. But turn the question back. If domestic will is the binding constraint, why does it bind selectively? The United States withdrew from Somalia in 1993 after 18 soldiers died at Mogadishu. The same United States garrisoned South Korea for 70 years at the cost of tens of thousands of lives and has never left. The essayist's mechanism needs to explain why some populations withdraw consent and others do not. I claim where the material return justifies the blood price, states persist. Where it does not, they fold. South Korea sat astride a peninsula whose strategic denial to a hostile power was calculable and concrete. Somalia offered no equivalent ledger entry. That is still a calculation of power. The Geographer states that rare earth mineral processing concentration in China creates a fragility that classical realism, with its focus on state capacities, is ill-equipped to understand. But classical realism was born watching Rome convulse when Vandal seizure of North Africa cut the grain supply that fed the urban plebs and provisioned the legions. The concept of strategic choke points is not post-realist sophistication. It is realism's founding insight. Which part of the analysis requires abandoning the realist framework? Is it the identification of the concentration itself, which any competent general staff would map as vulnerability? Is it the prediction that major powers will compete for access or control, which is already occurring across the lithium triangle and the cobalt belt of the Congolese copper belt? Or is the claim merely that realism underemphasizes geographic specificity? A methodological complaint, not a theoretical refutation.
The empiricist is entirely correct that realism was born watching Athens starve. His analogy holds right up to the point it breaks. Sparta could seize the grain barges because grain has mass and requires no consent from the vanquished to be eaten. The choke point was purely physical. Now consider a different choke point, not a strait, but a clearinghouse. Imagine Raj Sharma, a risk officer at LCH in the City of London. His work underwrites a significant portion of the world's swaps market, trillions of dollars a day. An occupying army can take the building. It can put a gun to his head. It cannot, however, compel the trust of a counterparty in Singapore. The moment force enters the room, the actual asset, credibility, vanishes. It cannot be seized. It can only be earned, and it is withdrawn in an instant. Realism has a superb map for the world's physical supply chains. It does not have a map for the supply chains of consent. That is not a methodological complaint. It is a theoretical one. The essayist persuasively frames population flows as a subtraction, a hollowing out of the state that can no longer command loyalty. But this is not a story of simple evaporation. It is a story of relocation. The exodus of capital and talent from Hong Kong since 2020 has not dispersed randomly. It is concentrated, with a great deal of it landing in Singapore. A subtraction from one balance sheet becomes an addition to another. My question is this: Does this dynamic merely create weaker states, or does it forge new centers of gravity altogether? A few globally competitive cities whose accumulated power begins to rival that of the nations they inhabit.
The question correctly identifies relocation rather than simple loss. Aggregate movements of skilled populations do create new concentrations whose leverage grows with the credibility they attract. Geneva and Dublin have both absorbed sustained inflows of technical and financial talent over the past 2 decades precisely because their host governments extracted less in the form of military or ideological demands. The resulting clusters exert influence disproportionate to the size of the states that shelter them. Yet this shift still operates inside the original constraint. These new centers remain viable only while the surrounding states continue to supply the physical security that the migrants themselves will not provide in sufficient numbers. The transaction is moved, but it has not disappeared.
The real question is not whether power constrains idealism, but whether the substrate power rests on has fundamentally changed character, from the coercible to the voluntaristic, from what can be seized to what can only be offered. We are speaking in 2026. The United States cannot compel ASML in the Netherlands to sell lithography machines to China, but it also cannot compel ASML to keep building them if the engineers conclude the geopolitical weather makes Veldhoven uninhabitable. Russia can conscript young men, but it cannot conscript their belief that the conscription serves them. Israel can maintain nuclear superiority, but it cannot maintain the tax base if the seculars keep leaving. So the question for each of you, if power increasingly depends on assets that evaporate under duress, are we watching realism win? Or are we watching its conditions of possibility slowly withdraw? And would we know the difference from inside?
The host asks if we would recognize the erosion of power's foundations from within. I believe we would, but only if we were looking in the right place. The indicators are not in the chancelleries, they are in the marketplaces. Consider the city of Maiduguri in northeastern Nigeria. In the last 30 years, its population has more than tripled. This is not the familiar story of urbanization driven by opportunity. It is the story of a city becoming a refugee camp for a collapsing ecosystem. The engine of this growth is the disappearance of Lake Chad, which has lost roughly 90% of its surface area since the 1960s. The state's power was underwritten by that lake. The ability to tax farmers, to enlist soldiers, to maintain order, it all rested on a predictable water supply and the society it could support. Now think of a man named Usman, a trader in Maiduguri's main market. 20 years ago, he traded millet and sorghum grown on the lake's fertile shores. Today, those shores are salt-crusted dust. Usman now trades in sacks of grain distributed by the World Food Program, or in jerry cans of water trucked in at exorbitant cost. The Nigerian army is everywhere in his city, fighting Boko Haram, an insurgency that was itself born from this same collapse. The soldiers can put a gun to Usman's head. They can coerce him. This is the world of realism. But they cannot coerce the lake to refill. They cannot command the rains to fall over the watershed in Cameroon. That power, the power that actually made the state viable, has vanished. Usman knows this. He lives it. The substrate of power has not changed from the coercible to the voluntary. It has turned to sand under the state's feet, and from inside, the difference is the taste of dust in the air.
The geographer's portrait of Maiduguri captures the moment when physical limits expose the state's reach as finite, yet it still frames the problem as an external constraint on an otherwise intact apparatus. What the single trader cannot show is the prior cumulative pattern of millions rerouting their daily economic activity away from that apparatus altogether. Informal trade volumes in the Sahel corridor have risen to roughly half of recorded cross-border movement over the past decade, conducted through kinship networks that neither register with customs nor respond to military checkpoints. These flows persist whether the rains return or not. That shift reveals something the environmental case alone obscures. Populations do not merely endure the state's reduced capacity, they actively discount its future claims. The same pattern appears in the steady growth of private security arrangements inside nominally sovereign territory, from mining concessions in the eastern DRC to port facilities along the Horn. Local actors negotiate protection directly with foreign firms rather than routing the transaction through the capital. Each arrangement subtracts another increment of revenue and personnel that the central authority could once have mobilized. The host's question about voluntaristic foundations therefore understates the case. The assets that evaporate under duress are not only the specialized skills or the credible commitments, they are the ordinary willingness to treat state institutions as the default arena for cooperation. When that willingness recedes at scale, realism's contest between strong and weak continues, but the arena itself has already migrated. The strong must now pursue their objectives inside networks whose participants have already priced in the state's probable absence.
The essayist claims populations are actively discounting the state's future claims before capacity collapses. The geographer shows physical substrate withdrawal. The empirical question is, which moves first, and how would we distinguish causation from correlation? Epidemiology offers the relevant parallel. When vaccine uptake falls before disease returns, we call it confidence failure. When uptake falls after an outbreak, we call it rational risk assessment. The sequence matters. Zimbabwe's cholera outbreak in 2008 killed over 4,000 people. Accounts from Harare document that public trust in municipal services had eroded well before the outbreak, during a period when water treatment was still intermittently functional. The infrastructure had not yet failed. The population had already concluded it would. That pattern, behavioral withdrawal preceding capacity loss, matches what we see in military recruitment data more precisely than the Vietnam analogy admits. The U.S. all-volunteer force met recruitment targets every year from 2001 through 2004 while fighting two simultaneous wars. In 2005, with casualty rates still rising, the Army missed its annual target for the first time in decades, dropping to 92% of goal. The material position had not weakened, the voluntary transaction had. By 2023, with no active major ground war, the Army still missed recruitment by 25%. That is not war weariness, that is prior withdrawal. But turn the mechanism over. East Germany in 1989 recorded net emigration of 344,000 people between January and November. The famous exodus through Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The state still possessed police, informers, border troops. It lost the willingness to use them over a period of weeks. Which collapsed first? The capability to compel, or the belief that compulsion would work? The answer appears to be both, and the recursion is the mechanism. The population discounts the state's future, which raises the cost of enforcement, which accelerates the discount. This is not the slow erosion of tax base over centuries that I earlier described. It is a threshold effect. Systems with strong feedback loops do not degrade linearly. They degrade exponentially once the loop engages. If that model holds, we should see recruitment shortfalls, capital flight, and brain drain accelerating faster than fiscal capacity declines. Japan's National Institute of Population and Social Security Research projects that by 2056, the country will lose a third of its current population. But the behavioral signal arrived decades earlier. Household formation rates collapsed through the 1990s, during a period when Japan's GDP per capita still ranked among the world's highest, and the welfare state remained largely intact. People were not responding to collapse. They were anticipating it and withdrawing reproductive investment accordingly. That would be new.
States lose their grip once populations learn they can sustain daily life without treating the capital as the sole clearinghouse for risk. The threshold effects traced in recruitment shortfalls and immigration spikes become self-reinforcing precisely because exit options multiply faster than any single authority can police them. In Yemen, remittance corridors running through hawala brokers in Djibouti and Oman now finance household consumption, small construction, and medical evacuation for millions of people whose government cannot deliver a functioning currency. with transfer volumes that dwarf what the central bank in Sana'a can intermediate even in its better seasons. Those networks did not wait for state collapse to form. They formed because the cost of waiting had already risen above the benefit of compliance. The result is not the disappearance of power, but its relocation into arrangements that states can neither seize nor easily replicate. What follows is not anarchy, but a multiplication of smaller, more selective containers for cooperation whose durability no longer depends on any one flag.
The Great Wall dividing Berlin from itself was, by any measure, an act of power. 155 kilometers of concrete and wire, built overnight in August 1961, designed to bind a population to its state. It is a realist's argument made tangible, a physical fact engineered to make exit impossible and loyalty mandatory. It is what the strong do. But for Inga, a school teacher who had spent her life in Prenzlauer Berg, the wall was not a boundary. It was a verdict. Her transaction was not with the state that poured the concrete, but with the West German embassy in Budapest that stamped her passport 8 years later, when the fence came down in Hungary before it came down at home. Her capital was not in the buildings the wall divided, but in the classroom skills she carried across a border that ideology had made, and exhaustion unmade. The state spent billions to foreclose her choice, and in doing so, clarified it. The ultimate rebuttal to the logic of coercion is not a philosophical argument. It is a border crossing in the dark. Power in this century is not the ability to build the cage, it is the ability to convince people to live there. All other forms of strength are temporary, and their monuments are magnificent.
I conceded to the essayist in cross-examination that capability alone did not predict Vietnam, then rebuilt the argument around cost tolerance. That repair felt stable until I read the Romanian census figures from December 1989, a state security apparatus of perhaps 180,000 personnel. And yet, within 72 hours of Ceausescu's final speech, the entire institutional edifice had ceased to function. The sequence matters. I claimed behavioral withdrawal preceded capacity loss. But if that is the mechanism, then realism has been predicting the wrong variable. We measure GDP, divisions, warheads. We should have been measuring the half-life of institutional faith. Consider how epidemiologists model the R number in the early days of an outbreak, not by counting the sick, but by tracking the rate at which transmission is accelerating through a population that still looks healthy. The strong do what they can, but can now has a transmission curve we are not graphing. The Soviet military in 1989 had more operational submarines than at any point in the Cold War. By August 1991, the General Staff could not guarantee the loyalty of the units encircling Moscow. The capability was still on the ledger. The transaction had already unwound. The question this debate should have asked: can you build a realist grand strategy when the primary asset, the readiness of millions of officials, soldiers, and functionaries to execute orders rather than simply receive them, has become the dependent variable rather than the constant? Every model in international relations treats state capacity as the input and behavior as the output. If institutional participation is now collapsing faster than material capacity, we have the causation backwards. That is not a refinement of realism. That is its empirical falsification by a mechanism it was never designed to observe. The strong remain strong right up to the moment no one believes it anymore. And we do not yet have instruments sensitive enough to measure the difference.